Well, welcome everyone. It's always true that as your church grows and the world around it changes, your vision needs to be refreshed. But the last few years have felt especially like survival mode. I think it was hard to be forward thinking or to dream God-sized dreams in the midst of it all. So now is the time to make some bold moves and prepare to cast a fresh vision for your church. And casting vision is one of the four roles we often talk about that a senior pastor can't delegate. There's casting vision, along with being the spiritual leader, primarily through your teaching, being a champion of culture, and of course, leading your team and your leaders. So on this topic of vision casting today, our focus will be on three things. First, how to ensure that you have vision clarity before you start casting vision. Second, how to cast vision in a way that rallies people to make significant investments of their prayer, their time, and their financial resources. And lastly, how to make your vision leak-proof. So it's going to be a good hour together. And today, really excited, we are joined by three great leaders. First, there's Michael Moore. Michael is the lead pastor at Faith Chapel in Birmingham, Alabama, and he's been the lead pastor since January, taking over for his father. So prior to that, he was the executive pastor for 10 years. Michael is a former member of the Unstuck Group and just a team favorite. And Michael, we are so glad to have you with us today.
I appreciate it, Amy. It's always an honor to be with you and Tony, and I'm excited about today's webinar.
And then we also have Doug Dameron, and Doug is actually a ministry consultant with our Unstuck team, but that's just his side hustle. His major gig is the pastor at Orchard Church in Brighton, Colorado. He and his wife planted that church 18 years ago, and today over 2,500 people gather there each weekend. In fact, someday we're going to have to interview Doug about the amazing summer his church is experiencing right now. But Doug, welcome.
Great to be with you guys. I'm excited. I'm coming to you from beautiful Breckenridge, Colorado. We're on our staff retreat and at about 9,500 feet. So I apologize to all of you who are roasting in the south. It's pretty nice up here this morning.
We'll let you know if we see any wild animals walk by, all right?
It could happen.
Tony, of course, Tony Morgan is the founder and the leader of the Unstuck Group. Boy, it's been 14 years, I think, Tony, since you founded the group, and we have served nearly 700 churches over that time. And it's always a pleasure to have you on this panel to hear your wisdom and your insights. So welcome to you as well, Tony.
It's good to be here, and I'm really looking forward to this topic. This is a passion area for me, and through the years, wanting to see churches engage a big vision, but actually to see it through. And so I'm looking forward to today's conversation because I think it's going to be helpful for us as pastors and church leaders to really accomplish what God has for our ministries. So looking forward to the conversation, Amy.
Well, as always, we have live chat going, so feel free to submit your questions and we'll respond in real time as well as we can, but also grab some of those questions for the live Q&A at the end. Our team will be in the chat answering questions, and that'll actually help us identify the questions to cover in the live Q&A that will benefit the most amount of people. And then, as always, if you're enjoying this webinar, please share it on Twitter and Facebook with the hashtag UnstuckChurch. Well, let's get started. There are lots of reasons you might be feeling the need to cast a new vision for your church. As examples, we're hearing from so many churches that they are completing the succession of a longtime pastor. For some churches, with all the population shifts happening, some churches find themselves in a dramatically different mission field. And this is probably most of you, a lot of churches continue to live out a vision for the ministry that was embraced pre-pandemic, but now feels a little outdated and irrelevant. But the reality of vision casting is that no matter how good you are, you'll never be effective if any part of the vision is unclear. Vision is about creating a clear picture of where we're heading into the future. So, Doug, I'm going to start with you today. Can you share a little bit about the time your church had to get clarity and cast a new vision?
Yeah, I'd love to. So as you said, our church is 18 years old this summer, and we were actually a portable set up and tear down church for 13 years. 11 of those years was in the same high school. We went through 4 different principals and God blessed. And then it was in November of 2017, we had an opportunity to move into our first permanent facility, a new building. And we kept saying over and over to our congregation, the only reason for a facility is to better facilitate our mission and our ministry. And our mission is to be people helping people find and follow Jesus. And we didn't want our people to think, well, now that we finally have a building of our own, a permanent facility, that we've arrived and we can just relax. We felt like, no, this is a brand new, fresh start to reach more people for Christ. And we just wanted to really drive that vision and opportunity home. So as we moved into that building at the end of 2017, we set what we called a 2020 vision, that by the end of 2020, we would see 5,000 new people say yes to Jesus, 1,500 people go public with their faith in baptism, and launch at least one new location. Now, that was going to all hopefully be accomplished by the end of 2020, and nobody let us know there was going to be a worldwide pandemic in the middle of that. And we were online only for 10 months. But to God be the glory, praise God, we were able to see all of that come to fruition, and it kept us on mission. We just said, we want to make sure that we are outward focused. We're not inward focused. We did a campaign during that. We called it For the One. It was based on Matthew 18, where Jesus said, leave the 99 for the one. We made up T-shirts and all that to cast that vision. To this day, people are still wearing those T-shirts. I talked to someone just 2 weeks ago at our church. They came up to me and they said, this is my one. This is the one I've been praying for. They just said yes to Jesus. They're getting baptized next month. So the vision stuck and it took off and it was great. And, one of the things we say a lot, and I think we say it here at the Unstuck Group, a great vision will compel and repel. And some people thought, well, are we just trying to reach lost people? Do we not care about the believers? But we said, no, we're a church that's trying to reach unchurched people. We're not trying to steal sheep from other churches. And so a good vision statement, I believe, will do both of those. But yeah, that was a pretty incredible time that people are still talking about.
I love that. What a great example. Hey, Tony, can you share any stories about being part of a vision casting experience where the vision was not clear? And because of that, what resulted because of that?
Yeah, actually, a couple of stories come to mind, Amy. One, I was working with a church, and this is a number of years ago, and we were going through kind of a visioning, a strategic planning process. And day one, I just noticed the senior pastor, he seems a little bit agitated, a little bit like, I don't know, just maybe not as engaged as I expected him to be. And that continued to build into the morning, the second day that we were together. And we're again talking about vision and direction. And just all of a sudden, the senior pastor just exploded with emotion. And he just had been building up for, more than a day in our planning conversations. And he was just pounding his fists on the table and said, I talk about our future vision all the time. Why is it that in this room, we're so unclear about our vision for the future? And it was just a reminder to me that for senior pastors, we feel like we're always talking about where the ministry is going in the future. And that's important. And as you mentioned up front, Amy, it's one of the roles that senior pastors can't delegate. But in addition to clear vision casting, there has to be tangible results that we're pursuing, clear objectives, bold moves, action plans to move that forward. And when all of that is not in place and clear itself, when we're just talking about it, but we really don't have a plan to move the vision forward, there's going to be a lack of clarity. And the senior pastor may not feel it as much because he or she is thinking that they're talking about it all the time. But for the staff, for your volunteer leaders, for your congregation, they're going to feel it. Another example, worked with a church and they did establish a clear vision with specific objectives, big, bold moves and action plans to move that vision forward. But it was a 10-year vision. And what they found is as they got into it, the first years, there was a lot of momentum around that clear vision. But by the end of that 10 years, they were starting to lose some traction and lose some momentum as a ministry because the vision was too long. So there was clarity initially and momentum initially, but that vision, that long term would not carry it through. And I think a lot of churches, Amy, as you alluded to, are feeling that on this side of the pandemic, that even if it was a fresh vision that was established early in the 2020s, because of what we experienced, it's kind of thrown all of us off a little bit. And we need kind of that sense of new direction on this side of the pandemic. And as a result of that, I think it's one of the reasons why we have so many churches reaching out to us right now. It's not that the church isn't healthy. They're just looking for new, clear direction and then a plan to move that forward. So those are a couple of examples that come to mind for me, Amy, about that, not having that clarity, how that can create some challenge for ministry.
Yeah, those are great examples. Michael, as I mentioned in your intro, you're in that unique position of taking the reins after the succession of your founding pastor. How have you approached creating vision clarity in this season?
Yeah, Amy, it's been interesting how I've had to approach it. Has been seasonal. As you mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, vision answers the question, where are we going? It answers the question, where are we heading? But I found in my journey at the beginning of this year, as I stepped into that lead pastor role, I had to, before I could cast vision of where are we headed as a local church, I had to first cast vision to the church just about who was included in the we. So what I mean by that is I'm 40 years old. My dad, our founding pastor, is 68. So we have multiple generations in our church. The natural assumption in this leadership transition was that as you put a younger face, more primarily in front of the congregation, that we would attract additional younger families. However, in the transition, I had several of our congregants who were retirement age, who began to ask questions of me, began to ask questions of leadership, not so much about where are we going, but am I at my age going to still be included in the future direction of the church? If I'm retirement age, are you guys planning to retire me from the vision of the local church? So I started off the year just really spending a season first casting vision of the type of church that I saw, the type of church that I envisioned, which was really a multi-generational, multi-site family. And I found that I had to settle that first. Who was included in the we? I had to settle that first before I talked about where we were headed. I think the second thing that I had to do in terms of gaining organizational clarity was just to realign some of my priorities. So as you mentioned, for the last 10 years, I had served as executive pastor. And so in that role, I'm paid to get into the weeds. I'm paid to be in a lot of meetings. However, when I look in scripture, men and women who received a clear vision from God weren't necessarily the people who were constantly in meetings or constantly in the weeds. It was people who had separated themselves from a crowd and was spending time, prioritized time talking to God. And so my schedule wasn't really set up like that. It wasn't set up to have seasons where I carved out to get away from the crowd, get away from a crowded schedule and just talk to God. My schedule, my rhythms were, hey, let's get in these volunteer meetings. Let's get in these details. In Genesis 13, it says that Abraham received a clear vision from God. He was crystal clear about what God wanted him to do, the direction that God wanted him to go. But Abraham only got that vision, the scripture says, after he separated himself from Lot. And so my team at the beginning of the year really had to not just help me to rethink my mindset, but also rethink my calendar to where I was delegating the day-to-day to our new XP, our senior leadership team. But as the leader of the church, I could then have seasons of margin where I'm talking to God to get clear direction. Because as people ask me or as leaders ask me, hey, where are we headed? Can you give us some direction? My answer couldn't be, I don't know, because I've been in all of these meetings throughout the week.
Good word, Michael. Good word. All right, let's move on to our second point here. Let's assume your church has done the hard work of clarifying the vision and get into some of the mechanics of effective vision casting. And Tony, I'm going to start with you this time. How do you make sure the vision is bold enough to rally a significant investment while not being so bold that it becomes demotivating for people to engage?
Yeah. So first of all, let's kind of back up for a second and talk about the difference between two words that sound very similar, mission and vision. Mission really should be communicating, this is who we are today. This is the purpose for our ministry. This is why we exist. It's who we are today. Vision is a picture of where we're sensing God's taking our ministry into the future. And so, in other words, we've not arrived there yet. It's a future destination. It's a future direction. And I think one of the reasons why visions aren't bold enough is we have found anyways, they tend to describe more of who we are rather than where God's taking us into the future. And because clear vision is a picture of a future that God has for our ministry, it really ought to change a lot of what we do today in order for us to be able to accomplish that future vision. In other words, if the vision is clear enough and bold enough, does it change how you invest your financial resources? If you have a bold vision, does it change how you use your time day to day? If you have a bold, clear vision, does it change how you allocate your strongest leaders? Because if the vision is big enough, you're going to want your strongest leaders taking charge and moving that vision forward. Is the vision bold enough that it changes how you pray? Because you recognize in our own efforts, we can't accomplish this. We need God to move. And if none of that has to shift, in order for you to accomplish your vision, then I would argue the vision is not bold enough. And I think, again, one of the reasons why churches tend to not have a bold, clear vision is because they're using words to describe who they are, their mission, their values. They're describing something that they value as a ministry, and that's important. We need to do that. Maybe they're describing their strategy of how they're going to do things. But what they need instead is a clear picture of where they're sensing God's going to take us, and for it to be bold enough that it's going to shift how we do things today in order to see that vision get accomplished. The other side of this, though, that you asked about, Amy, is how do we know if the vision's too big, such that it becomes demotivating? And there are probably two factors that we need to consider here. It's number one, we all share a faith in God and what God can accomplish. But secondly, this principle, biblical principle of counting the cost. Let me read this passage from Luke 14. But don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money. And then I love this line. And then everyone would laugh at you. And I think, let's just make it as clear as possible. Here's a reminder. We need to count the cost. And if we don't do this, there's a very good chance that the rest of the world around us is going to be laughing at us. And unfortunately, I've seen that happen because churches take on something that is so significant that only God could make it happen, which is a good thing. But they also haven't paid attention to this principle of counting the cost. And it's not just related to financial cost. It's people, it's time, it's leadership. It's that the platform we're giving to whatever we're pursuing. We have to count the cost ahead of time to understand, has God prepared us for this next step? And if we don't do that, we run the risk of losing credibility with our team. We run the risk of losing credibility with our congregation. And most importantly, we run the risk of losing credibility in our community with the people that we're trying to reach. And I saw a specific example of this firsthand. One of the communities that we were in years ago started to construct a new church building. It was going to be their first church building. And they got started, but the building stopped construction about 12 months in and sat there vacant for years because the church took on something that was so significant that they didn't appropriately count the cost. And because of that church building just sat there vacant for years. And as you can imagine, I don't know how much laughter there was in that team or in the community, but it was a very visible and the reminder to the community that this church wasn't prepared to see their vision through. So it's a tough thing to weigh our faith and trust in God to provide, but also making sure that we're being good stewards of the resources, financial, people resources, gifts. We're counting the cost to make sure that we can actually see that vision through.
Michael, maybe can you share some examples of how you've seen a clear vision rally significant investments of prayer, time, and or financial resources?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll share one internal example from our church. Several years ago, God began to give my dad, our founding pastor, a vision for the homeless in our city, a heart for the homeless in our city. And as he initially began to share that vision with our internal congregation, it began to rally some short-term relief donations. So coats, shoes, backpacks, kind of short-term relief. But as he continued to cast that vision over time, we realized that the direction that God actually wanted us to go in with the homeless in our city wasn't just short-term relief donations, nothing wrong with that. But we realized that the direction that he wanted was total transformation, total life change. So my dad began to cast a vision for a facility downtown, a care center downtown, that we wanted to purchase, that we wanted to staff, to provide services to the homeless. As we began to cast that vision, it rallied the finances of the congregation. So we were able to purchase a facility in the downtown heart of our city, renovate it completely debt-free, laundry services, showers, all within the facility. We didn't have to staff the facility with employee staff because we had more than enough volunteers. The congregation were really excited to rally and donate their time toward it. But what was also great, showers were great, laundry services were great. We were also providing some other services to them. But as we really got into that issue of homelessness, we realized how comprehensive it really was, that to completely have transformation, some people needed just basic services like dental services, vision screening. Some people needed legal services. And so as a church, that wasn't our expertise. But what was so amazing about it is as the vision for this life change began to spread beyond our congregation, God began to raise up organizations outside of our church, people who didn't even go to our church. Whereas we weren't experts in providing dental services, other local dentists were. And they decided that they wanted to partner with us to help to see this life change. We weren't experts in vision screenings, but we had local experts who were willing to partner with us. So when the scripture says, write the vision, make it plain so that the people can run with it, the people that God will rally can be inside of your church. But if we don't limit it to just the insiders, God can actually put it on the hearts of people outside of your church if that vision is compelling enough to then rally time and money towards seeing what God has called you to do.
That's a fantastic example, Michael. That certainly seemed to rally all three of those things, right?
Absolutely, both inside and outside of the church.
Thanks for sharing that. Hey, Doug, let me ask you a quick question. What is your process for rolling out a new vision at your church? And as you share that, specifically, what roles do you own as the senior pastor? And then how do you involve your team?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. That's a great question. One of the things that we like to say is a great vision simply expresses timeless truths in a timely way. And I think it's important when you're casting vision to start with the scriptures, founded in the Bible. And when we were preparing to move into our first building and that permanent facility, like most churches, we needed to raise some funds to do that. And so we launched what we called a legacy campaign. And one of our slogans was, we're not building a building, we're leaving a legacy for generations to come to help more people find and follow Jesus. And we were trying to raise about $3 million. And we went to the scriptures in 1 Chronicles 28 and 29. There's just a great example of David, casting that vision that Solomon, his son, is going to build the temple and Israel to get behind it. And David started with the leaders and the officials, and then he went to the families, and he just kept widening the circle. And that's what we did. We started with our key staff and then our key leaders and volunteers. And then by the time we rolled it out to our entire congregation, 80% of the people were already bought in. They knew what it was. And we followed that example of David. And just like I said, widening the circle. And one of the things that I learned, I'm kind of more of a left brain person, which I like stats and data and those kinds of things. But there's right brain people like my wife that likes the stories. And I think when you're casting vision, you have to appeal to both sides of the brain. The left side that likes stats and the right side that likes stories. And we tried to do both of those in the demographic studies and the stats of our community, but then sharing the stories of life change and, shooting videos of those stories and saying, we want to see more stories like this and you can be a part of that. But getting both of those. And when it comes to, my role and the team's role, when it comes to our team, I really believe this, that people will buy in once they have an opportunity to weigh in. And so we didn't just say, here it is. We asked a lot of questions. We created a lot of dialogue. I remember we had people at our house all the time and circles and coffee shops and just talking through these things. And I've learned through the years that people will support what they have a part of creating. And we want them to be a part of that creating process, and people will get behind it. They'll get more excited about it. And then when it comes to my role as the senior pastor, I have to be passionate about it, which is not a difficult thing for me. I kind of was born with a lot of passion, but if I'm only 70% excited about it, then the people are only going to be 50% excited about it. So, I've got to be like a 10 in my excitement and my passion. I have to be all in, believing it as I share and I cast that vision. I have to do it with clarity. I love what Tony was saying. You got to be specific with a vision. It can't be just this general, well, we want to reach as many people for Christ as we can. Well, of course, but how many people? By what time? How are we going to know if we reached that goal or not? We say that we measure what matters, and people matter. And so we wanted it to be measurable. And I had to lead by example. I'm sharing stories of my neighbors that are all around me, their names, and how I'm trying to connect with them and how I'm trying to invite them and bring them to Christ. And one of the things that I learned is when it comes to casting vision, you can feel like you're saying it over and over and over like a broken record, and you think surely they hear it and they're tired of hearing it. And what I've learned is you think they've heard it, but they don't. And what I would say is when you're casting vision, if you think you're saying it too much, double it and keep saying it, because a vision that is repeatable is memorable. And so we tried to use phrases that, are catchy and people still use them to this day. Like when we were doing our legacy campaign, we said, this is not a fundraising campaign. This is a faith raising campaign. This is about raising our faith to trust God that we're going to reach more people for Christ. We're not building a building. We're leaving a legacy for generations to come. But I think just widening that circle is the key, and getting people to weigh in, then they will buy in.
I love your example of just inviting people into that vision process. When we're on the ground with churches, I think a lot of pastors feel a sense of relief that although they own the vision and they have decision rights on that, like you're saying, you've got to be behind it. You don't have to go up the mountain and come down from the mountain with the vision. Involving a team of people around you to bring those ideas forward and to kind of fill your tank as a lead pastor. I hope any pastor that feels that huge burden can find some relief knowing you can involve a team. In fact, the best visions come when you've got many advisors around you. So thanks for that example. Well, let's move to our final key point. And in this last section of the conversation, I'd like to talk about how we make vision stick. And Doug, you were just kind of going there, but how we keep it from leaking out and having the team going back to the way things have always been done. And just making the vision plain, of course, is not enough to keep people focused on it or to equip a church to accomplish it. So, Michael, I'm going to start with you again. What's the role of strategy, in your opinion, in making vision sticky and setting a church up for success?
Yeah, Amy, that's a great question. Again, vision answers the question, where are we going? Where are we headed? I think strategy answers the question, how are we going to get there? So I'm in Alabama. If I cast a vision to my organization, letting them know where we're going. Hey, by the end of this week, we're headed to Nashville, Tennessee. We're headed north. The direction, that future vision is clear. However, if I just stop there, what's still unclear is how are we going to get there? And there are many different strategies, many different ways of how. we could get there. We could go from Alabama to Nashville on foot. There's pros to that. It's free, but there's cons to it. We're in the South. It's hot. We could go to Nashville on a bike. That's faster than walking on foot. But again, there's some cons to it. Or we could book a flight and get there by the end of the week. Because it's hot, we're in the South. Let's say that we're going to book a flight to go there. Once I'm clear on how we're going to get to the destination, it then sets us up for success once we start to have alignment conversations. In other words, there are going to be a ton of ideas, good ideas, but they're not going to be aligned to the direction that we're wanting to go. And if we're not clear that we're buying an airplane ticket to get to Nashville, then I'm going to have, as a pastor, as a ministry leader, all kinds of ideas related to bikes. Hey, these are the newest, latest, and greatest bikes. We need to hire a bike mechanic to work on our bikes to get there. If I don't have clarity on the strategy of how we're going to get there, all of those conversations around bikes or walking to Nashville will now seem valid because we haven't taken the where and then cascaded it down into the how.
And Doug, how do you give away ownership of the vision to your team and equip them to run with the strategies you've outlined?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think Tony and Michael both mentioned this. It's so important that you have a vision that's big enough and compelling enough that it cannot be accomplished by any one person, that it's going to take a team and teams of teams in order for us to accomplish that. And we have to all own our piece of that vision and that goal and what that is. And so, for instance, this year that we're in right now, our team, we prayed about what do we want our WIG, kind of our wildly important goal to be for the year. And we said we want to see 10,000 personal invites by our church this year in 2023. Now, we cannot determine if people are actually going to show up or come, but we can determine who we invite, who we pray for, who we engage with. And so we're tracking all those. Well, in order for us to see 10,000 invites by our church, we've got to all be in on this. We have to all own our part of this, and our departments and our teams, they all said, well, we think, the kids department can do 1,000. We think, the worship department can do, 500, whatever it is. We've broken all those down. And our campaign we're doing is called Plus One. Who's your plus one? You're coming to church. Who's your plus one? One person, one couple, one family. And, we did t-shirts and all that kind of thing. And like I said, each department owns a part of that. And we have a huddle at the beginning of our services in all the departments. And so they'll be asking people, how many people did you invite this week? Who's your plus one? We've been recording those. And so everybody has buy-in. Everybody has ownership of that. A great book is 4 Disciplines of Execution by Chris McChesney and Sean Covey. 40X, sometimes it's referred to. He really talks about that, breaking it down, having a scoreboard. And so we have an all-staff huddle every Monday for 30 minutes. And when we're trying to take on these big visions and initiatives, we have a specific goal that we're trying to hit, and we do check-ins every Monday, and we ask. And so there's accountability built in, and we have some fun with that, and we get to celebrate all of us together as a team whenever we accomplish that. And I know sometimes people can look at that and say, well, that just seems like it's all about the numbers. But as I said before, we measure what matters, and every number has a name. And every name has a story, and every story matters to God, so it should matter to us. And so we're going to measure those things, and we're going to own those together as a team, and we get to celebrate as a team all that God is doing.
I experience that with churches frequently, Doug, the success that comes when people understand what part of this do I own, what part of this does our ministry own. So I love that idea of, giving everyone a clear goal and then talking about it often, talking about it publicly. That just elevates that vision, throughout the team.
First of all, I think we need to clarify, are those birds in Doug's background, or does Michael have birds in his office? What?
It's probably mine.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Amy.
I just had a hummingbird zip right by. I don't know if you guys picked it up. It was pretty cool.
That is funny.
All right. Well, Tony, yes. In your opinion, how do you build in accountability for seeing progress towards the vision and staying focused until it's been completed?
Well, I'm not going to repeat some of the great thoughts that Doug and Michael have shared, but I mean, that one of the things with being a pastor and having vision is you have to repeat it constantly in order for it to be leak proof and to make sure that the follow through happens. And again, the reminder, it needs to be bold enough. And this is what's crazy, especially for your high capacity staff and leaders in your church, volunteer leaders. If the vision's not bold enough, if they find themselves kind of shifting into more of maintenance mode, if I can use that term, when it comes to ministry, kind of just, we're doing the same thing that we've always done. If they're not pursuing something significant, strong leaders will not stick. They're probably going to look for other opportunities to engage their leadership. So that aside, I think one of the challenges, and I would say especially for the larger churches that are listening in today, is one leader can't be both the vision caster and the person that's actually driving the vision forward in your organization. In other words, I like the language that the guys that built the EOS system, Traction, they talk about these two roles of visionary and integrator. Big churches, larger churches need both of those roles, and the senior pastor can't carry both of them. So typically the senior pastor will be the visionary leader in that scenario. And then an executive pastor, or sometimes in larger churches, multiple executive pastors will have that role of integrator. So how are we going to take the vision and make sure it gets integrated into our structure, our financial resourcing, our strategy? How are we actually going to move this vision forward? And senior pastors cannot own both sides of that, especially in larger churches. And so once you have an executive pastor, somebody else on the team that's actually helping you integrate it, drive the vision forward, that leader will be responsible for making sure you have clear action plans in place that identify in writing who's responsible for doing what by when. If you don't have a written action plan, you might be praying for vision to be accomplished, but you don't really have a plan to move your vision forward. And we like to, at the Unstuck Group, encourage the churches that we're working with to think about written action plans in 90-day cycles. So rather than think about everything that needs to be accomplished to get our vision, to move our vision forward, let's just look at these next 90 days. And let's just focus on specifically who's going to be responsible for doing what within the next 90 days. And what we've seen is that really helps churches in particular get some momentum, get some traction around their vision so that it doesn't become leak proof. They're actually continuing to have accountability for that follow through that needs to happen. And what I would say is, this is just we talked a little bit today about one of the key roles senior pastor can't delegate is vision casting. We also have to remember one of the key roles the executive pastor can't delegate is that vision integration. How are we going to drive the vision forward? We need both responsibilities and leadership, especially in the larger churches that are listening in today.
And Tony, as you were answering that, I went back to the beginning of the webinar when Michael was talking about having to shift from being the integrator to having to become the visionary. And so I like that separation there. And even if you're a smaller church, to be thinking through, we need to have those actionable plans and somebody to be responsible for them other than the lead pastor. So, well, I want to thank each of you for joining us today. You guys are pretty smart. Doug, Michael, Tony, thanks for sharing your thoughts. Appreciate your stories and the encouragement that you hopefully brought to our listeners today, and that our listeners found something tangible to apply to their next steps when it comes to casting vision. We're going to transition now into our live Q&A. So thanks to everyone who has been submitting questions. Our team has filtered them. And like I said at the beginning, we've chosen a few questions that hopefully have the broadest appeal. So let's move into that.
Record months of voluntary job departures. 80% of employees are disengaged in their work. There's a tension between executing the mission and the care and development of our people. Management is dead. People want to be led and developed, not managed.
Well, Tony, we have some great Q&A that came in during our time, and I actually get to be the question asker. So
It really
are
does
you
make me
ready?
it really does make me a little bit nervous, Amy. Yeah. So
But I've
I will
learned
do
your
my best
trick.
though.
I've learned your trick in Q&A. If I ever throw you one or someone does that, you don't want to answer, you just go, well, Amy, what do you think it is? So I'm
Okay.
ready
All
for
right.
that.
Thank you. All right.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. So here's the first question that came in. Mark asked, can you clarify what it means that a vision will repel as well as compel?
Yeah. So obviously, I believe that if the vision really is coming from God, and you mentioned it, both of us may have mentioned it at the Unstuck Group, we really advocate for teams of leaders coming together to discover vision, future direction, to confirm dreams and bold moves for the future. But what we see commonly, of course, is when you hear clearly from God and then you begin to pursue that future vision, it is going to really compel people from your congregation to be a part of that with their prayers, with their time, with their financial resources. But here's the crazy thing, and it's a good thing. We've also seen that it will repel some people. When you get real clarity about where your ministry is going in the future, there will be some people that will take a look at that and realize, oh, if that's the direction that they're going, that may not be a fit for me. And that's okay, because the great thing about ministries in our communities is there really are all kinds of churches for all kinds of people. And I think it's really helpful for people to recognize either I want to be a part of this vision, I want to be a part of this and really contribute and invest in what my church is doing. I think it's also a good thing if some people realize through that process, oh, if this is the direction the church is heading, then maybe I do need to consider another church. I think everybody wins, especially for the body of Christ.
Great answer, Tony. I would have said the same thing. Jim asked this. He said, how often or when does the vision of a church need to be assessed, evaluated, and adjusted or realigned so that the church doesn't get stuck and continues to move that vision forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll be honest, my opinion on this has changed, even in the 15 years of the Unstuck Group. Because early on, when we were helping with churches, we really would look kind of a longer term window into the future for where the church was going. And really, I think it was compounded by the pandemic. What we're seeing from churches right now is we need, almost every church right now coming out of the pandemic needs a fresh look at their vision. And with that too, a shorter window for what they're sensing God has for them to accomplish. In other words, let's not look out 10 years. Let's not look out 15, 20 years. Let's just figure out in the next year or 2 or 3, what is it that God has for us? And let's move that forward. And here's what we've seen, Amy, and I know you've experienced this as well, is if we can help churches just focus on the next year or 2, over time, they tend to accomplish significantly more in the long run. And I think it's helpful just to have those shorter term windows for what we're trying to accomplish to really help us stay motivated and engaged in the vision that God has for our churches.
Yep, so true. All right, so someone asked this, Tony, when do you as a pastor know that the vision you're casting is really being caught by the members, that they're actually beginning to respond to the vision in action?
I think you just answered it, but I will be curious to hear your take on this. It's when you see people respond. And so when people begin to become invested with their prayer, when they become invested with their time, when they become invested financially, that's when you know people are receiving the vision and they're wanting to engage with it. And that's when you know that your vision casting is really working. And here's what's crazy about the days that we live in now. It used to be, the hardest thing to do would be to get people to invest their finances, their money into a future vision. But what we're seeing in recent years, if you can actually get people to invest their time, their gifts, to actually get involved and sing the vision through, That's probably now these days the clearest picture of whether or not we're really accomplishing our vision and rallying people to the vision that God has for our ministry. But any additional thoughts you have on that one, Amy?
Yeah, I'll just say what you just said, but we have been talking about this for a few years. The greater demand for people now is time than money. And so when people do give their time, it's a big reflection of their buy-in. The only other thing I'd add, Tony, is when you actually hear your people talking about it as well.
Oh, yeah,
You know,
that's good.
I mean, at a minimum, is your staff talking about it? Are they excited about it? Are your key volunteer leaders, you know, asking about it, talking about it, sharing it? Is your congregation speaking from it? Those would be key indicators that people have actually caught the vision.
And then maybe one more thought, just
Yeah.
for clarity of whether maybe an indicator that we haven't clearly casted vision for the future and articulated how it's going to be accomplished is that question. If you're hearing from your key lay leaders, your key staff leaders, questions about, okay, I understand the vision, the direction they're heading, but I'm unclear about how we're going to accomplish that. That's when you know there's some additional work that needs to be done, and we need to bring some more clarity so that when we rally people, including our key leaders and staff leaders, that we're actually pulling in the same direction, we're aligned, and we're moving forward together.
Well, and I loved Michael's analogy about if we're going to fly by plane, you know, we don't need to talk about bikes and rentals and things like that. It was just a great word picture of the need for more clarity around the how. Here's one that I'm going to ask and answer, and then you can see if you agree with this. So someone asked, my lead pastor is not particularly wired as a visionary, but he's teachable, and I'm helping him find that voice. As the incoming executive pastor, how visionary must my lead pastor be for healthy growth? So I'll just share from my experience. The church that I worked with for over a dozen years, our lead pastor was an amazing communicator. He could cast vision, rally it, so great with story, just really a gifted individual. But behind the scenes, it was really our executive pastor who had that vision thing, that growth thing. He was the one who was advocating, pushing, leading our executive team to have those conversations. And so he was really the instigator. But once our lead pastor had to agree with it and catch the vision. But then he was a master at communicating it and rallying the team. So have you seen that as well?
Yeah, I have. And I think it's, again, this is the beautiful picture of the New Testament church is we all come together to form the body of Christ. And we all don't have to have the same gifting as every other leader. And so to recognize, you know, this is not as much of a strength for me, but who else on our team can help me take those next steps? That's a great thing. Just side note too, I mean, we have a lot of great resources available at the Unstuck Group to maybe provide some coaching and some next steps that you as pastors can take beyond just today's webinar with your vision casting, and certainly encourage you to take advantage of that. And then, not to be selling, because that's not what we're intending to do today. We want to help you. But the reality is we come alongside a lot of pastors that are looking for help, not only to clarify vision, but a little bit of coaching too, on how they can do that with their churches. And obviously we'd love to help ministries like yours do that.
Yeah. All right. Ken and Stu both asked the same question, Tony. How do smaller churches, so churches that are in that 150 to 250 range, how do they separate or divide the vision casting role and that integration role? What advice would you give the smaller churches?
Yeah. So what I've seen some smaller churches do in the past is, and oftentimes it seems like the senior pastor is the primary vision caster, even in smaller churches, but where senior pastors, and this would be universal, any size church, usually senior pastors are gifted vision casters, but when it comes to actually driving that vision forward, that's not in their natural strengths typically. And so obviously with larger churches, that may be hiring an executive pastor or another senior leader on our staff team to help with that integration role. But what we've commonly seen in smaller churches, it's somebody within the congregation, a lay person, maybe leading in the marketplace or some other community organizations. And they are very gifted when it comes to actually moving strategy, moving vision forward. And that person then coming alongside the senior pastor to kind of play that role in smaller churches. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what I love about the smaller churches that understand the priority, the roles over maybe sometimes the committee structures that they are carrying from their past.
Mm-hmm.
I realize church committees can fulfill some of the responsibilities we need in our congregations. But really what we're looking for here is gifted leaders who can play these specific roles no matter what size the church is. And so if you can't afford to hire somebody for that role, I bet God has someone in your church that can still be that person for you to really help you move your vision forward.
And as you're saying that, Tony, another thing we talk about with churches often is to have these higher level volunteer roles available for the leaders in your church. And this is a great example where someone who has a leadership gift, they probably wouldn't step into that role because you said we need a volunteer. They'd step into that role because you said I have a challenge and I need a leader who can carry this for me.
Yeah, and let me add to that. Speaking as a leader that has responded to asks like this from my churches in the past, I would much more use my leadership gifting to accomplish something like we're talking about, which is really to help volunteer my time to help move the church's mission forward rather than being asked to sit on a committee. I would much rather use my leadership in that way. So again, it's just maybe rethinking how we're leveraging our most gifted leaders in our churches.
Great word. All right, Alexander asked this, Tony. He said, how do you deal with casting a vision in a 160-year-old church that maintains traditional ministries because of that history, but that also need to possibly be eliminated to better focus resources to achieve the church's vision? I know that's not a simple question, but I know it's one you'd be passionate about.
Yeah, it is. And it's because not only do we get to work with younger churches, church plants, and churches that have just launched with, in fact, the church I was at this past week is only 10 years old. And so, but here's what's crazy. Even a 10-year-old church has their traditions that have been established. And so I don't think you have to feel like, because we've existed as for 160 years, we have traditions. Other younger churches don't have traditions. I'm telling you, every church that's been open for more than a few months has some sort of traditions that are starting to get established. But here's the key. Don't just change. Your first step isn't to eliminate the traditions or change the traditions. That's not your first step. Your first step is to go back and ask the question and clarify with your leadership, why do we exist as a church? Where is God calling us to go in the future? Then we start to talk about how are we going to accomplish that and who's going to be responsible. And as you get agreement about why we exist and where God's taking us in the future, your focus will be more on maybe the new traditions that you're going to have to establish to move that mission and vision forward. And over time, what we've seen is we're so focused on where we're going as a church that the kind of walking away from some things we've done in the past aren't as important. And primarily that happens when we actually start to see real life change happening in our ministries. As that life change starts to happen because we're embracing new traditions, new methods, it's a lot easier then to maybe walk away from or end some of the traditions that we've held to in the past. But like I said, your first step isn't to end traditions or change traditions. Your first step is to ask those questions and get clarity around those questions with your leadership.
Really good. All right. I think we have time for one or two more questions. This is a question that Dan asked, and I hope I'm representing it well. He said, I think when it comes to envisioning people, he said, do we envision with leaders of the church or a large church membership or both, so that there's buy-in from the large group rather than the smaller group? Does that make sense to you?
It does. And I actually think Doug may have referenced this in his comments earlier, that as they were crafting vision for the future and then talking about how they were going to move that vision forward, it started with a small group of leaders. And then over time, they kind of expanded to greater circles of influence before they started to reveal vision and direction to the entire congregation. And that's a best practice that we've seen in
Mm-hmm.
churches of every size. When you start with a smaller group of leaders and then expand over time to the growing circles of influence, by the time you're casting vision to the entire congregation, a lot of the initial maybe concerns or questions have been addressed in previous conversation. And I think as leaders, then, especially as senior pastors, we're better prepared to address questions and answer those questions up front as we're casting vision to the congregation. So thinking about kind of growing out those circles of influence with the vision casting process.
Yeah, that's great. And we did that on the podcast, I think, a few months ago, too, for our listeners, if they want to reference back who needs to be communicated with. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I know that we did not get to every question that was submitted, but for those that we were unable to answer during the webinar today, we will try to get to those through social media. And if you had a question that you didn't ask, you can also submit those questions on social media using hashtag #UnstuckChurch, or you can email us at help@theunstuckgroup.com. Of course, we will email every participant here a link with all the resources that we mentioned on the webinar today. And if the Unstuck Group can help you take your next steps, we'd love to talk to you. You can connect with us at theunstuckgroup.com. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'm excited to see what comes out of this webinar when it lands the bold moves at your church.